Okay, so think about this for a second. How in the world do you scientifically study something you can't even see, like the human mind? I mean, for centuries, that was a job for philosophers. But then, in the late 1800s, everything changed. We're going to dive into the story of how psychology was born. And here's the kicker. It didn't come from one single neat idea. Oh no, it was born from a huge clash of competing visions for what it even means to understand ourselves.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the very first psych lab, then jump right into the big debates that really define the field. We'll see how the mind was first put under a microscope, then kind of got thrown out altogether, then explored in its deepest, darkest corners, and finally, how it made a huge comeback. All right, let's get into it.
All right, let's set the scene. We're in 19th century Germany. Back then, if you wanted to explain why people do what they do, you basically had two options: philosophy or physiology. But one professor had this revolutionary idea to create a whole new science dedicated just to the mind itself.
And this is the guy Wilhelm Wundt. His big argument was that psychology needed to stop being just a branch of philosophy and become its own independent science. He wanted to study the mind with the same kind of rigor that a biologist studies an organism or a chemist studies a compound. A pretty bold move, right? In this place, this is where it all officially started. In 1879, Wundt sets up the first formal laboratory for psychology research. And yeah, this is the date everyone points to as the birthday of psychology as a science. So what were they studying? What was the big focus? One thing: consciousness. Our moment-to-moment awareness of what we're experiencing.
Wundt's new approach got a name: structuralism. And I love the analogy here, because it really helps it click. The mission of a structuralist was basically to be a chemist for the mind. They wanted to find the fundamental building blocks of our thoughts, things like sensations, feelings, and images, and figure out how they all snap together to create our experience.
So how'd they do it? Well, their main tool was something called introspection. But, and this is super important, this wasn't just, sitting around and daydreaming. No, this was a super disciplined process. They'd have trained participants in a lab, expose them to something, like a flash of light or a specific sound, and these people had to report every single sensation, every single thought as it was happening. They were trying to make our inner world observable and measurable.
Okay, so Wundt's ideas start to spread, especially over to the United States. But, as you can probably guess, as soon as psychology had its first major theory, it also got its first major rebellion. And this kicks off the first big debate that would totally shape the future of the field. Meet the challenger, William James. He was this brilliant American scholar who read Wundt's work and basically said, "You guys are missing the entire point." James wasn't interested in the static parts of thought. He was way more fascinated by what our minds actually do for us. And this slide just lays out the disagreement perfectly. You've got Wundt's structuralism, which is like the anatomy of the mind, trying to map out its structure. Then you have James's functionalism, which was all about the physiology of the mind. What's its purpose? James was heavily influenced by Darwin, and he argued that consciousness must have evolved for a reason, to help us survive and adapt. This idea, right here, is basically the seed for huge modern fields like evolutionary psychology.
And this is James's most famous idea. He described consciousness as a stream. It's always flowing, always changing. For him, trying to break it down into little frozen pieces, like Wundt was doing, was like trying to scoop up a handful of water from a river to study the river. You'd lose the very thing that makes it what it is, its flow.
So, for a while, this whole structure versus function debate was the main event in psychology. But then, a new generation of thinkers comes along, and they look at both sides and say, "You're both wrong." They argued that studying any kind of consciousness was just unscientific because you can't see it or measure it directly.
This pretty radical idea came from a guy named John B. Watson who founded behaviorism. He basically said if psychology wants to be a real science, it has to throw the whole idea of the mind in the trash. Forget introspection, forget feelings, forget thoughts. The only thing we can actually observe and measure scientifically is behavior, what people do. Now, even though psychology eventually brought the mind back, the core ideas of behaviorism are still incredibly influential today in things like therapy and even dog training.
But get this, while behaviorism is taking off in America, back in Germany, another group was launching its own attack on structuralism. They agreed that breaking consciousness into little pieces was a huge mistake, but their solution wasn't to get rid of the mind. It was to look at it in a totally different way.
And to really get what they were talking about, just take a look at this image for a second. What do you see?
I'm willing to bet you saw a bright white triangle pointing up, right? But look again. There's no triangle actually drawn there. Your mind created it by filling in the gaps from those other shapes. And this little illusion is the key to understanding this next huge school of thought. This is the heart of Gestalt psychology. Gestalt is a German word that basically means a complete form or a whole. Their argument was so simple but so powerful. Our minds don't see the world in little bits and pieces. We actively organize what we see into meaningful wholes. That triangle you saw? That was your brain in action, proving their point. This focus on how our minds organize things was a huge influence on modern studies of perception and problem solving.
So far, everyone's been arguing about what we can consciously observe, either by looking inward or looking at behavior. But at the exact same time, there was a physician in Austria who was cooking up a theory that would completely turn psychology on its head. He argued that the most important parts of our mind are the ones we can't see at all. And that physician, of course, was Sigmund Freud. His theory, psychoanalysis, dropped a bombshell. Our personalities are shaped by these powerful forces hidden deep inside of us. He argued we're driven by unconscious thoughts, hidden memories, and deep desires, especially, and this was a huge shock to prim and proper Victorian society, by our powerful sexual urges. And this right here is Freud's most famous metaphor. He said the mind is like an iceberg. That tiny little tip sticking out of the water, that's our conscious mind. But the enormous, massive part hidden beneath the surface, that's the unconscious. And according to Freud, that's where all the real action is. Now, a lot of his specific theories are still heavily debated, but his core idea, that hidden unconscious forces shape our behavior, absolutely changed the way we talk about ourselves forever.
So for decades, psychology was dominated by these two giants. You had psychoanalysis, which saw people as being driven by these dark, unconscious conflicts, and you had behaviorism, which saw us as basically just reacting to our environment. But then, in the 1950s, two new movements rose up to challenge both of them.
First up was humanism. Thinkers like Abraham Maslow felt that the other schools were just way too pessimistic and dehumanizing. So humanism came along with this much more optimistic view, emphasizing our free will, our choices, and our amazing potential for personal growth. You can see its DNA all over the modern field of positive psychology, which is all about studying happiness and what makes life worth living.
At the exact same time, another revolution was brewing, and this one was sparked by technology. The invention of the computer gave psychologists a brand new, powerful way to think about the mind. This kicked off the cognitive revolution. All of a sudden, psychologists started seeing the mind not as some mysterious black box, but as a kind of sophisticated computer, an information processing system. This wasn't just another theory. It was a total game changer that led directly to the cognitive approach that is so dominant in psychology today.
And this timeline just lays out the whole clash of ideas we've been talking about so perfectly. You start with Wundt's lab in 1879, then you get the big debates of the early 1900s, and then the massive revolutions of the 1950s. You can see how each new school of thought was really a reaction to whatever came before it, constantly pushing and redefining how we try to understand ourselves.
So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, the history of psychology isn't some nice, neat, straight line. It's this messy, vibrant, and totally fascinating conversation between brilliant people. And it leaves us with this final, really important question to think about. Does having all these different ways of looking at the mind mean we failed to find the one right answer? Or is that very diversity the field's greatest strength as we try to understand the most complex thing in the known universe, ourselves?